Montana Territory. Spring of 1879, the wind carried snowmelt down the ridgeline as 38-year-old Bernetta Boone watched her last chance at a life disappear down the trail in a cloud of wagon dust. She stood outside the small clapboard church in Red Elk Crossing, her best dress clinging to her frame in the breeze, the lace collar stiff with starch. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edges of her shawl. Inside the church, her younger cousin Clara was being married. To a man Bernetta had once been promised to, a man who had told her, plain as spit, that she was too old now. "You are kind, Bernetta," he had said, "but I need a woman who can still bear me children." As if she had not already borne two, as if that counted for nothing. She turned from the church and walked stiffly down the dirt path toward the edge of town, her brown boots coated in red dust. The sun caught in her dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples. Her children were grown now, both married and moved away. Felix in Colorado, Faye in Nebraska. They wrote sometimes, but they had their own lives. She had no one left here. Bernetta had been widowed young, barely 25, when her husband died of fever after the harvest. She had raised her children alone, working other folks' kitchens, and sewing for ranch families too proud to mend their own shirts. And still, here she was, discarded like a worn-out pot. She passed the edge of town and kept going, unsure where her legs meant to take her. She only knew she could not stay and listen to the bells ring for someone else's joy. Half a mile down, she reached the river. The cottonwoods had just begun to green, and the water rushed high with melt. She sat on a log and stared into the water, her throat aching with unshed tears. A horse's hoofbeats shifted the quiet. She turned. A man rode down from the trees, tall, broad-shouldered, his black braid falling over one shoulder. He wore deerskin leggings, a woven sash, and a rifle slung across his back. She recognized him from the edge of town. Not many Lakota came this far west anymore, but she had seen him once at the trading post last year. He had not spoken, just nodded, quiet and watchful. Now he dismounted and approached, leading his horse by the reins. "You are far from the others," he said, his voice deep and calm. She stood, brushing her skirts. "I needed air." He looked at her, his dark eyes steady. "You are sad," she blinked. "You do not know me, I know sadness." She looked away, her chest tight. "I am too old for hope," she said, her voice barely above the wind. "Too old for a husband, so I was cast aside. That is all there is." He was quiet a long time, then he said, "I am called Vekiyah Kone." She looked up. "Bernetta Boone," he nodded. "You are not too old, you are just alone, there is difference." She lowered her eyes, unsure what to say. His gaze flicked toward the sky. "A storm is coming, you should not stay here." "I do not care." "I do," he said simply. She looked up at him again, startled. He stepped forward, his tone still gentle. "Will you ride with me? There is shelter not far." She hesitated. But the clouds were darkening and the wind had turned sharp. She nodded. He helped her onto his horse, a strong chestnut mare, then swung up behind her. His arms came around her carefully, not too close, just enough to steady her. She felt the warmth of him, the quiet strength in his frame. They rode through the trees, following a narrow trail along the river. Within minutes, the first drops of rain fell, cold and hard. He took them to a small hunting shelter, little more than a lean-to of logs and bark tucked beneath a rock outcrop. The fire pit was dry. He dismounted, gathered wood, and had a fire going within minutes. She sat near the flame, warming her hands. Her dress was damp, her hair darker from the rain. "You built this place?" she asked. He nodded. "Years ago, for hunting trips. You live nearby, farther north." "My people have space there, but I come here to trade. Sometimes I stay, sometimes I help." She looked at him. "Help who?" "Those who need it." She gave a short breath of laughter. "Then I suppose I qualify." He looked at her, and something passed between them, a quiet, honest recognition. She was not young, and he was not either, but there was a steadiness in him, a calm that settled her. "You have children," he said. She nodded. "Grown, married, gone." He nodded, accepting that without judgment. "I had a wife once. She died of lung sickness." "No children. I am sorry." He sat across from her, his eyes on the fire. "You do not seem like a woman who should be alone." "I have been alone a long time. You should not be." She stared at him. "Why do you care?" "Because I see you." The words hit something deep in her. She turned her face away, the firelight flickering on her cheek. They stayed there as the rain came harder, the fire crackling between them. Vekiyah passed her a blanket from his saddlebag. She took it, her fingers brushing his. That night, she lay wrapped in the blanket, listening to the rain and the steady breath of the man across from her. For the first time in years, she felt safe, and she did not feel alone. By morning, the rain had passed, leaving the world hushed and damp. Mist clung low to the meadow grass beyond the shelter as gray light sifted through the trees. Bernetta woke slow, the blanket still drawn around her shoulders, the scent of wood smoke and wet earth thick in the still air. Vekiyah had already stirred the coals and added kindling. He crouched near the fire, slicing dried meat with a bone-handled knife. His movements were quiet and precise, like someone long used to silence. She shifted, her joints stiff from the cold ground, and he looked over his shoulder. "There is tea," he said, nodding toward a small tin cup warming near the flame. "From spruce needles, it helps the breath." She sat up, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you." He handed her the cup without comment. She sipped, the taste sharp and resinous. It settled in her chest, warm and strange. "What will you do now?" he asked, not looking at her. She stared into the trees. "I hadn't thought further than yesterday. You could ride north. There is space and quiet." She raised an eyebrow. "You inviting me, I am offering. You choose." Bernetta studied him. There was no coaxing in his voice, no hint of persuasion, only steadiness. "I don't know you," she said softly. "You know how I speak, how I sit with silence. That is more than many." She looked down at her hands. The skin was dry, the knuckles worn. Her whole life had been made of giving, stitching, tending, waiting. No one had ever asked her to choose something for herself. "I've no land," she said, "no dowry, not a thing to offer but the work of my hands." He stood and walked to his mare, checking her hooves. "I do not need a gift. I need someone who listens, walks beside." She paused, then rose and moved to the edge of the trees. The ground was slick, but her boots held. She watched the river in the distance, high and silver with runoff. "I've spent near 2 decades trying to be what others needed," she said, her voice low. "I don't think I remember what I want." Vekiyah stepped beside her. His presence was quiet, not pressing, the way a tree stands near a stone, unmoving but certain. "I will not hurry you," he said. "If you come north, it is not as wife, not unless you ask it." She turned to him, startled. "You'd lie beside a woman and not claim her." "I do not take what is not freely given." Bernetta felt the wind shift through the trees, lifting strands of her hair. No man had ever spoken to her like that, not with patience, not with respect. "I'd need time," she said. "You will have it." Her eyes met his. In them she saw no hunger, no flattery, only truth, carved deep by loss and waiting. They rode out by mid-morning, following the river north. Vekiyah showed her where the wild onions grew near the bank and pointed out where elk had passed in the night. He did not speak often, but when he did, it was with purpose. By dusk, they reached a wide meadow rimmed with pine. A small cabin stood near the edge, smoke rising from a stone chimney. A woman stepped out as they approached, her hair braided and streaked with gray, her shawl woven with red and ochre. Vekiyah dismounted first. "This is Vekiyah Kone," he said. "My cousin's wife. She lives here for the season." Vekiyah nodded but said nothing. She looked Bernetta over, then gestured toward the cabin. Inside, the air smelled of sweetgrass and cooked beans. The walls were lined with baskets and pelts, tools hung neatly. Bernetta felt the quiet order of it settle into her chest. "You may stay here," Vekiyah said. "I will sleep outside." Bernetta looked at him, unsure what to say. She had nothing to repay such kindness. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. His eyes held hers. "Because I see you are worth the space." She turned away quickly, pretending to study the hearth. Her throat felt too tight to answer. Later, after Vekiyah had gone to her sleeping mat and the fire had burned low, Bernetta sat alone, her hands folded in her lap. Through the small window, she could see Vekiyah by the trees, seated near his horse, watching the stars. She did not understand the shape of her life now, but for the first time since she was a girl, she felt no pressing weight of expectation, only the soft hush of possibility. And in that quiet, a small warmth began to grow. The days turned warm with the slow unfurling of summer. Bernetta rose each morning before the sun fully crested the far hills, her hands already busy with the rhythm of living hauling water from the creek, kneading dough for ash bread. brushing the dust from her skirts before stepping out into the light. She stayed in the cabin with Vekiyah, who spoke little but moved with a practiced ease that Bernetta came to admire. They worked side by side without need for constant talk, the silence between them neither strained nor empty. Vekiyah came and went with quiet regularity. He brought fresh berries in a woven pouch, a carved spoon for her hand, or a length of softened hide that he asked her to stitch into satchels. Each offering was made without preamble, yet never unnoticed. One afternoon, as she sat scraping the last of the lye soap into a tin basin, she glanced up to see him standing by the corral watching the sky. "You always look like you're listening to something," she said, wringing out the rag. "I am," he answered without turning. "The wind changes before it speaks." She set the basin aside and walked to where he stood. "What does it say today?" He looked at her then, the sun catching the edge of his cheekbone. "That you are not just passing through," her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "I hadn't decided yet. You have not packed. I haven't unpacked either." He stepped aside so she could lean her elbows on the fence rail beside him. The horses shifted in the grass, tails flicking in the heat. "I watched my father bury his second wife," he said, voice low. He did not speak for a season after that, not because he had no words, because he had too many and none worth saying. She turned her head. "And you?" "I was younger. I thought I had time, that what was meant would wait." His fingers closed around a strip of rawhide hanging from the post. "But time does not wait. It leaves you standing still while everything you love walks away." Bernetta didn't answer right away. Her eyes followed the slope of the land beyond the fence, where the sky touched the earth in a wide, open hush. "I don't know how to choose something that isn't survival," she said. "I've never had the luxury." He turned to her. "This is not luxury, it is life, yours if you want it." She studied him. The breeze lifted the edge of his braid, and a small scar at his temple caught the light. She wondered how it had come to be and whether it still hurt when the weather turned. "I'm not a girl, Vekiyah. I can't be charmed into something that won't stand." "I do not offer charm, I offer steadiness." "And space beside me." She felt her throat tighten, not with fear, but with the unfamiliar weight of being seen without expectation. No man had ever given her that, not even the one she'd buried in her youth. That night, after the others had gone to their beds, she stepped outside alone. The sky was thick with stars, the kind that only show themselves in wide, empty places. She crossed the yard barefoot, her dress brushing her calves, and found Vekiyah seated by the unlit fire pit. "I don't want to be someone you taken out of pity," she said. He looked up, his tone even. "You are not. I've never had anything that was mine, not really, only what was left over." He shifted, not toward her but toward the fire ring. "You are not what's left, you are what remains." She sank beside him, her knees folding easily despite the day's labor. They sat close but not touching, the warmth of their nearness enough. "I don't need a vow," she said, her voice barely above the hum of the night, "but I need truth. I do not know how to give anything else." They sat until the chill settled and the moon rose higher. When she finally reached for his hand, his fingers closed around hers with the kind of quiet certainty that asked nothing, but promised everything. And for the first time in her life, Bernetta did not feel like she was waiting to be chosen. She felt chosen already. Bernetta tied her apron at the waist and stepped into the smokehouse. The cool, shadowed space held the scent of cedar and cured meat, and she moved with care, lifting the strips of venison Vekiyah had hung 3 days prior. Her hands were steady, her shoulders strong from weeks of splitting wood, hauling water, and grinding maize by hand. These were not tasks she had learned as a young woman. They belonged to a life she'd grown into, not one she'd inherited. Outside, the sun had climbed high. She stepped into the yard, blinking against the brightness. Vekiyah was seated near the edge of the pines, carving a flute from a length of chokecherry wood. He paused when she approached, his knife resting against the grain. "That's a fine piece," she said. "It is stubborn wood," he replied. "But it holds its shape once it chooses to." She looked down at the shavings curling at his feet. "I know what that feels like." He set the carving aside and stood, brushing the bark from his palms. "There is something I want to show you." She followed without question, walking beside him through the tall grass that edged the meadow. They climbed a narrow ridge above the cabin. where the wind moved freely, and a wide sweep of land stretched below rolling green, broken only by a line of elk tracks and a distant glint of the creek. Vekiyah pointed toward a small grove of aspens growing close together. I planted those when I was younger, after my wife passed. Bernetta turned to him. Why there? It was the only place that stayed green the year the river ran dry. I thought if something could live then, it could live always. She walked to the nearest tree and touched the white bark. The trunks were tall now, their leaves whispering above her. They've done well. So have you, he said. She faced him, her hand still resting against the tree. I never would have imagined this. I did not expect you, he said, but I recognized you. She took a long breath, watching the branches shift. I've had days where I thought I'd gone too long without being wanted. That maybe I'd forgotten how to be close to someone. He stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that she felt the heat of him. You have not forgotten, you just haven't been given reason to remember. She turned her face to him. And what if I want more than remembering? Then you will have it. But not because I give it, because we build it. She nodded once. Then I want to start. Later that week, Vekiyah packed her satchels and left for her brother's camp farther east. Before she mounted, she handed Bernetta a small bundle of dried sage wrapped in deer hide. For the doorway, she said, to keep peace near. Bernetta watched her ride off, the mare's hooves soft against the earth. That evening, she hung the sage by the doorframe and swept the cabin with a new care. Not because it was her duty, but because it was hers now, in truth. Vekiyah returned from a hunt near dusk, carrying a fresh rabbit and a sprig of wild mint. He laid both in her hands without a word. She looked up at him, her eyes steady. I want to stay, she said. He nodded once. Then we begin. They cleaned the rabbit together, the rhythm of their work effortless. As the stew simmered over the fire, he reached into his pouch and drew out the flute he had finished. He lifted it to his lips, and the first notes rose soft and low into the air, weaving through the rafters like something ancient and kind. Bernetta listened with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the man who had offered her no promises, only presence. And in every quiet act he had kept it. When the music faded, she stood and walked to him. She rested her palm over his heart and laid her cheek against his shoulder. He held her without urgency, and they stood that way as the fire crackled low and the stars began to gather overhead. She had not come seeking love, and he had not spoken it aloud. But it lived there in the stew they stirred, in the flute he carved, in the way he watched the wind to know when it would turn. And in that quiet, lasting peace, Bernetta Boone found not just a place, but a home. Not just a man, but a partner. Where the aspen trees had taken root, so had she. And nothing would move her now. By late July, the land was thick with heat, and the air hummed with the dry warnings of crickets. Bernetta stood at the edge of the vegetable patch she'd started along the southern slope, wiping her forehead with the edge of her sleeve. The squash flowers had opened wide, and the beans had climbed nearly to her waist. She bent carefully, tying a crooked stalk to its stake, her movements sure and practiced. Vekiyah crouched nearby, fitting a new handle to the hatchet that had cracked the week before. His tools were laid out in neat order beside him, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. Every so often he looked over at her, not to check on her, but as though the sight of her steady hands gave him something to settle against. I've been thinking, she said without looking up, about keeping hens. He glanced toward the brush along the edge of the clearing. There's a hollow log there, could turn it into a coop. I was hoping you'd say that, she replied. I've already asked the trader to bring 2 pullets next time he comes through. He set the handle down. You've made plans. I have. I think it's time. She stood and brushed the dirt from her skirt, then walked to where he sat. He tilted his face up to her, and she rested her hand lightly on his shoulder. I want to build something that lasts. Not just for a season. Vekiyah reached into his satchel and drew out a length of dyed sinew. It was deep blue, the color of shadowed river stones. He handed it to her without a word. She turned it over in her palm, curious. It is for weaving, he said, or for binding. You may choose. The meaning settled slowly, like warmth spreading through her chest. She closed her fingers around it, not needing to speak. That evening they sat side by side on the cabin step, watching the last light pool gold against the ridge. The crickets had quieted, and a distant owl called once before the hush returned. "I received a letter," she said after a while. "From Faye. She and her husband are traveling west before winter. She wants to stop here." He nodded. "You will see her. You'll meet her. I will be glad of that." She looked down at her hands. "I don't know if she'll understand this life or us. She will see that you are content. That will be enough." Bernetta leaned her shoulder against his. "I'd like her to know I chose this. That it wasn't because I had nowhere else to go." "Then tell her," he said simply. "She will believe you." Late that night, as the fire burned low and the wind moved through the open window, Bernetta lay beside him, her hand resting over his heart. "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. He turned his head slightly. "I've left many places. This is the one I came back to." She traced a small circle on the blanket. "I think I came back to myself here." He took her hand and kissed the inside of her wrist, slow and certain. "You make this place more than it ever was." She smiled into the dark. "Then we'll stay, and we'll grow roots so deep no dry season will touch them." He held her close, and neither of them spoke again until morning. The seasons turned as they always did. By autumn, the hens laid regular eggs and the garden had gone to seed. Bernetta preserved what she could, her shelves lined with jars of stewed apples and dried beans. She taught herself to card wool from a trader's sheep and spun thread by the fire, her fingers learning a new rhythm. Faye arrived with her husband in mid-October, her cheeks flushed from travel, her eyes sharp with questions. She paced the cabin, touching the walls, the woven rugs, the door frame where Bernetta had hung the sage. "You're different," Faye said, sitting at the table after supper. "I'm myself," Bernetta replied, maybe for the first time. Faye's husband sat outside with Vekiyah, the two men speaking in easy turns about trapping and winter stores. When Faye stood to help clear the dishes, she paused and looked at her mother. "You're loved here," she said. "I am," Bernetta answered, "and I love back." Faye reached for a bowl, her face thoughtful. "Then I'm glad we came." They stayed 2 nights, then rode on, leaving behind laughter in the walls and a new name carved into the beam above the hearth, Vekiyah Kone. Winter came early with a heavy snow in November. The cabin held firm, the roof tight, the hearth warm. Vekiyah carved a cradle from pine in the evenings, though no child had yet been promised. When Bernetta asked why, he said, "It is good to make space for what might come." She kissed his cheek and said, "Then I'll knit the blanket." In the quiet of that long, white winter, they lived not as two people merely surviving, but as a pair who had chosen each other across time and grief and the wide, unkind places of the world. And when spring returned, it found them side by side in the garden, hands in the dirt, lips brushing in the soft light of morning, together still. Always.